Well, I'm still trying to get my head around this job I'm in, leading you. About 3 months ago, I was getting organised for a post-political life. I was preparing a course of lectures at one of the universities where I have a professorship. I was finishing off a novel that comes out next month. You should be prepared, because it's a political thriller. It was written on the assumption I was no longer in politics. It's not going to win the Booker Prize for Literature, but I'm told it won't win the Bad Sex Award either. So brace yourself for a bit of publicity. But the main thing I was doing was I was in training for the Pro-Am Ballroom and Latin Championships in Blackpool in November. So I'm afraid my life has taken a new course. I didn't expect the election. I think a lot of us didn't. But thanks to a magnificent effort by the party in my patch, I got back with a good majority, and I'm now leading you. I think probably the obvious point to make is, I'm here primarily to listen. I want to speak to you for 10-15 minutes. I think I've set out what I believe and what I want to happen in that manifesto, which is available online. I don't know how many have seen it. But I'm going around the country. I think this is my 12th, 13th meeting so far. Really just trying to gauge your views, what it is that motivates you and what your concerns are. But I think the starting point is we've just had an election with rather mixed results. There were some good things. We've now got more MPs. We've got a better gender balance. And underlying it, and thanks to Tim Farron, I think we owe him a debt for it, a real energy in the party and a massively increased number of members. And that's good. It means I've got a better base to build from than he had. But there's a downside. The election in many places was very disappointing. We didn't cut through. We had a lot of lost deposits, including with super candidates, but they were squeezed or they sent their troops to help in target seats, all the good reasons. And our vote share didn't really move from 2015. So that's the mountain I now have to climb. I think when we try to analyse what happened, I think we all massively underestimated the Labour Party. They were written off a few weeks before the election as a bit of a joke. Corbyn wasn't taken seriously. They were assumed to be shambolic, and they were nothing of the kind. Just to give an example, one of the things I've been trying to do in the last few weeks is to communicate with our members using social media. I was asked to put out my views on Europe, and I did a Facebook that got to about 100,000 people in 48 hours, and I was told, wow, this is fantastic, until somebody pointed out that Corbyn gets about 10 times that on a daily basis. And that gives us some indication of the organisation that we're up against. Actually, I think the Labour Party is fallible for all kinds of reasons. They've misled a lot of people into believing they were a pro-Europe party, and you notice that Corbyn is working hand in glove with the Tories to deliver this extreme, hard form of Brexit, taking us out of the customs union, the single market. They've already ratted on their obligation to students over student debt, and the organisation of the party around this very militant group called Momentum is causing an enormous amount of tension. So I don't think that they're in any way impossible to deal with, but you have plenty of experience of this up here. Many of you have built up a local government base, Newcastle, Gateshead, increasingly in Durham, big success stories. So I don't think they're invincible, and we've got to turn that particular tide. But there are several reasons why I'm optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't have taken on this job if I wasn't. I think the first reason is that British politics has become horribly polarised, quite ugly. And you know, on the one side, you've got these zealots, ideologues in the Tory party, very close to UKIP, the tail wagging their dog, and they're using at the moment Theresa May as a kind of human shield, or human sponge, as she's sometimes called, soaking up the punishment. But you know, very, very aggressively right-wing, and their image, which Cameron spent a decade trying to detoxify, has been ruined by this tie-up they've got with the Democratic Unionists. So you're dealing with people on the right who are quite polarised and quite extreme. And then on the other hand, you have the Labour Party, Corbyn and his people. You know, they're as militant, if not more militant, than militant tendency. It was a world I knew. Many of you know my background. I was a Labour councillor in Glasgow in my 20s. That's how I started involvement in political life, and I was involved in the civil war with Corbyn and his people, and they're there, and they're now better organised, and they're more aggressive and more illiberal than they were before. But there's a vast space in between, vast space, and I think a lot of people in this country, whatever the region, are wanting something that is more moderate, reasonable, civil, the kind of politics that we provide. And I think the demand for that kind of politics will grow when people realise what they're being offered by the other two. I think the second reason I'm optimistic is because of what's happening around Europe. I mean, to be frank, our messaging in the general election wasn't great. The second referendum sunk like a lead balloon. I don't think it was because it was a bad idea. It wasn't. It was a perfectly sensible, thought-through policy, but it was premature. A lot of people thought we were just harking back to the last referendum, saying we were disrespecting the popular vote and so on. But I think as things evolve, it will become increasingly obvious that not only are we right, but that we're the only people who are right. I think two things are emerging quite fast. One is that there will be some really very damaging consequences. It's beginning to hit people in advanced manufacturing, which is very important up here, that their whole business model depends on being able to trade freely in Europe, on being able to trade without checks on borders. If you're in a factory that's swapping widgets backwards and forwards across national frontiers, the last thing you need is to be inspected at every transaction. And that's what will happen if you withdraw from the customs union. I think the other thing that's becoming apparent is the sheer horrendous complexity of this whole business that nobody really anticipated. The Brexit people just went round until quite recently saying, we can do this in an afternoon. And they're now hiring thousands, literally thousands of civil servants in order to do it. Just to give you an example, we've seen in the last few days what is potentially at stake here. There's quite a small agency, but very important, called Euratom. Does a lot of very advanced nuclear science work in the UK, nuclear fusion, produces isotopes for cancer research, and it exists because it's a very good European collaborative institution, but it gives Britain enormous advantage. Then the Tories spotted that it comes under the European Court of Justice. So for dogmatic reasons, they've said, we want out. So the whole of Euratom has now got to be reconstituted as a British agency. Their European staff are leaving. The complete vacuum is resulting in the organisation being in a state of meltdown. Now, I just mentioned that as one example of something that will be multiplied 100 times in the next year or so. If you think of something fairly simple and uncontroversial, like civil aviation, most people are not aware that the way we run civil aviation is fundamentally European. There's about 9 different treaties governing everything from air traffic control, aircraft safety, environmental standards, protecting consumers, ticketing arrangements. All of those things will have to be redone. New agencies created to manage it. Or if you take biosciences, which is an area which is very strong up here, particularly around the universities, they have a regulatory body based in the UK. It's absolutely fundamental to testing. That agency is having to move. All the British staff are being fired. And when you multiply this many, many times over, you get the beginning of a feeling of the kind of chaos that is going to be unleashed by Brexit. And I think when that is properly understood, people will begin to say, well, actually, those Lib Dems, they were right. And the position we have at the moment is what we're saying, what we're trying to do in Parliament, in the country, is to try to work with people in other parties. We're not tribal. If there are sensible Tories, sensible Labour people, let's work with them to try and stay in the single market, the customs union, the university research collaboration, the environmental standards and the rest of it. But if, as I expect, this isn't going to work, then we have to look for an exit from Brexit, as I put it. And that exit from Brexit would come in the form of giving the public an opportunity to vote on the outcome of these negotiations. And the choice they will then have is, do you want to continue this route, messy, dangerous, damaging though it is, or do you want to stay where we are within the European Union? And that confrontation is coming up, and it will be very, very clear that we are the only people giving people that choice, because the Labour Party and the Tory Party, whatever their other differences, are absolutely complicit in the hard Brexit that's now being pursued. So my third reason for being optimistic is, I suppose it goes back to my comfort zone, what I would call my mastermind special subject, which is economic policy. We're in a very weird state of affairs. If you think back on the election we just had, hardly anybody talked about economic stuff. The Tories had a manifesto that had no numbers in it at all. Well, that's slightly untrue. They had page numbers, but they had no numbers. The Labour Party were better. They did have numbers. They didn't add up, but they were numbers. And we had a lot of numbers and a lot of credibility, and everybody who was concerned about sensible financing, about long-term industrial strategy, the kind of thing that we did in coalition, acknowledged that the Lib Dems had got it right. But unfortunately, nobody was listening. But I think in future they will listen. It's been generally understood, as long as I've been in politics, that unless you're a political party that is sensible, and it's not just us, I mean in the past, your Ed Balls and Gordon Brown and Osborne and Clark and so on, whatever you think about them and what you think about their party, they did understand that economic competence matters. And that's all now being thrown out of the window. And I think we have an opportunity, and I have an opportunity, to reassert it. And I say that, I don't mean this to be grossly immodest, but I'm not putting myself forward as a leader of a small party. I want to be competing as an alternative Prime Minister. That's my job. And I've got to be credible and plausible. And when it comes to these core issues, I think that's exactly what I can do. But my approach to this is not just to be a kind of moderate, sensible bean counter, there are plenty of them. I think what I also want to do is to represent the values and the ideals that our party has. And where I start with that is we're living in a country that at the moment is horribly disfigured by some extreme inequalities. They're inequalities of wealth, they're inequalities of geography, different parts of the country. Very, very different world up here from the world I've just come from in the last week in London, in Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol. Very different and massively unequal in their opportunities. And big differences between generations. I did a piece in The Observer last week, I don't know whether you saw it, trying to draw attention to the extreme inequalities of wealth that have built up because of what's happened in property markets, something you probably haven't seen much of around here. But in my constituency, a fairly modest semi-detached house will go for well over £1 million. And if you bought it a generation ago for £10,000, you're now a millionaire. You haven't done anything, you haven't earned anything, you haven't contributed anything, but you've acquired massive wealth simply through the workings of the property market. And those inequalities have really got to be dealt with. And I've advocated some, potentially quite controversial measures in taxation to try to do that. But I think the most difficult one for us is the issue around generations. We're in a very, very awkward position as a country where I think for the first time in my lifetime, young people can expect to be poorer than their parents. That's the position we're now in. I mean, they may be lucky as individuals and they may have well-off parents, but most young people will be poorer than their parents' generation, as things now stand. And that's partly about housing and the fact that young people just can't get access to the housing market because of prices and rents. And I want our policy to be really radical in that area. John Shipley here is our spokesman on it, and I want to work with him to produce some really radical outcomes. But the other issue which I do want us to confront is this issue about how you pay for higher and further education. I mean, we have a problem as a party because of what happened 7 years ago around tuition fees. I was in the middle of it, and looking back, it's fairly clear that we, as I think my colleague Simon Hughes put it, we got 2 out of 10 for the politics, but 8 out of 10 for the policy. What's happened has actually been very sensible. It's kept universities properly funded, they're expanding, doing high quality work. Nobody pays to go to university, you pay a graduate tax based on your income later in life. And lots of disadvantaged kids now go into higher education and never did before, unlike, say, Scotland, which doesn't have our system. But nobody's listening to that, I don't think. It's done us harm. The Labour Party have made a deal of it, even though they're themselves betraying students on student debt. So I think I want to do 2 things about that. I think, first of all, we've got to revisit the policy and acknowledge that it presents us with problems. I have an open mind about how you do it. It may be just a question of making it more like a genuine graduate tax, but there may be other ideas that I'm open for. But I want to do something actually much more radical, which is, and I'm developing this idea with our policy people, which is to have a really good offer for all young people, whether they go to university or not. And don't forget, 60% don't. And I developed this idea working with the National Union of Students. They invited me in about a year ago, and they said, we want you to work with us. And I was initially rather surprised. I thought maybe they're bringing me in to be stoned or something. But they were very friendly when I got inside. They said, well, actually, we see you as a friend and an ally. And it transpired that the president of the National Union of Students, who I'm working with, is a very impressive, young, black, single mother who left school at 16, never went to university, got herself a degree working part-time in an FE college, and told me that the majority, a substantial majority of students in Britain don't go to university. They're in FE colleges, adult colleges, and doing apprenticeships. And her question to me was, what are you going to do for them? And the proposition I'm trying to develop is that we give to all young people an offer. It could be a learning account, voucher, or whatever you want to call it, fairly substantial. depending on what's affordable, 10,000 quid, something like that. And they can use it to offset their fees if that worries them. They can use it for postgraduate work, or if they're one of the 60% who don't go to university, they can use it for adult learning, for skill training, something that boosts their living standards. And we treat all young people the same, equal mirth. And we get away from this very damaging idea that there are two categories of people, the clever academic people and the not so clever non-academic people. It's done terrible harm to this country. It's mean that we're much more backward than Germany when it comes to things like basic skills. So I want to develop that idea as part of an attempt to put us at the front, not at the back, of the agenda of young people. And I'll just add one final thing on that subject, which is, you know, there are some really big issues, overarching issues like climate change, the environment, that just got lost in the last election. These are things which, in the coalition, we did really good work on. Our party's got a long, strong, green thread running through it, and I want that actually to be at the centre of what we do. And then that takes proper account of the interests of future generations, not just the status quo. But can I just make one final point, and then I'll sit down and answer your questions, which is, it's all very well as having good values and, you know, good policies, nice speeches, but that's no good unless we win, and we're seen to be winning, and we're seen to be politically credible at taking on the other parties. And in this region, in the past, you've done phenomenal work, particularly in local government, in building up a base in very difficult conditions. And we've just got to get back to that. I can give you leadership from the top, but ultimately this depends on grassroots work, community level work, slow toil, you know, with, you know, community groups, focus leaflets, all the rest of it. But hopefully doing it in a more modern way. I discovered in the course of this election, the power of social media. One of my advantages is that I know what I don't know, and my social media campaign was led by my 14-year-old grandson. He did brilliant work, and we actually out-competed the other people with these techniques. So I think a combination of national leadership that I hope I'll give you, some good but traditional community-based campaigning, local government level, and using modern, sophisticated techniques of communication, I think we can just break through the middle. Not just adding more seats here and there, but doing something fundamentally big and different. But thank you.